So the question is, what do you do when you have a very historic, highly detailed interior and you want to come up with some kind of design for an activity going on in that space? And the answer is you probably don't model it in Revit or in SketchUp. You probably use Photoshop. And so the goal here is to show you a couple of techniques that you could use when you just basically don't have the time to do the full-on computer model. And first of all, the easiest thing is to put in scale figures. And let me go to a web browser here. Let me go to this one. And search for some people. Now, usually I use Google, but Google has gotten sued, and so I can't use, well, you can use theirs, and you can kind of drill through to their images, but I'll show you on Bing just because it's a little easier. You could just type people and look for people, but what I would recommend is looking for alpha channel people, and this is kind of the first concept here for this type of rendering, which is alpha channel. It represents a layer on an image that is transparent. It's just another word for transparent. So if I go to images and I've searched for alpha channel, and I use the PNG format because it natively supports transparency, supports this alpha channel. And by the way, all of your Revit renderings, when you render on the cloud, those support it, and if you use iRender on SketchUp, that also supports it. Anyway, and now I've got a whole bunch of iRenders, transparent renders, and I can come in here and I can filter for large or even extra large size. It does help to know what size your drawing is, but this one is 1600 by 1600 pixels. So if I go and open the image, okay, in Google, if you click on the image, it will open it in a new web page. It will go to the web page that has the image. In Bing, it just opens the image. Why is that exciting? Because I can now just copy the image, just right-click on it and copy it, and I can go to Photoshop and paste it right in. Okay, and what you'll see when you post it in, it comes in the original size. So this image is probably about 1200 pixels high, I think. So it'll size your image purely based on the pixel dimension, not on the number of pixels per inch. So then you just need to resize the scale figure. The way you can do it, one way is you can just put the figure next to some door, some element. Usually the feet are the thing that you want to look at. Move the feet to the door and then stretch the head down to match the size of the door. Now what I've done here, let me just make this person a little bigger. And by the way, I hold down Shift when I resize the scale figure. That just helps. It keeps it in the same aspect ratio. Let me fade the background out, and then I put in the elements of perspective, the horizon line. And again, when you're faking things in, you don't really know how big things are. You can't use scale like you would normally in SketchUp or Revit. So you have to use the perspectival tricks. In this case, the horizon line is typically at eye height. So if I stretch this scale figure to be at about eye height, and I'll click check, then you'll see it should look correct. Okay, here's my layer, and I'll drag it up above the elements of perspective so that she stands in front of the line. Okay, and this is really nice if you happen to make a copy, and I'll drag this one say to the very back of the room. I just put her feet in the back of the room, and again resize her while holding down Shift. Okay. By the way, and if you're not seeing the resize grips here, make sure that this Show Transform Controls is clicked. Okay, so there you go. That's a quick way to get scale figures. Let me make another copy. I'll drag her over here by the window. Now that's the easiest way. The next easiest way, sort of easy, is to use something I can't quite show you on my computer, which is the ArchVision library of scale figures. And they are available on any of the PCs in the VPAC. And those also come in with the transparency layer. And what's nice about them is you can rotate the people. You can make them spin around before dragging them into your view. Anyway, and that's kind of a nice thing. Even also available on campus, a little bit harder, is to take a figure, and I'll show you this using my Bing search engine. Instead of searching for a transparent alpha channel, if you type in people and white background, and what we'll give you is people, scale figures that have a white area behind them. These even work better. I don't know why. I think that's pretty good. But let's take one of these and do the same thing. Again, I can just click through to the largest image. You can do this on any other search engine. Click through to the largest image. But it's easier on Bing for the time being. So if I have a white background, and you can do this on form fonts as well, if you have a subscription, which we have on campus. I'm not on campus, so I can't access it. But if you go to the form fonts web page and you type in photo figure, Fotofigure, you will find a whole bunch of people with white backgrounds. Anyway, I'm going to just paste in that image here of the cow. There it is. Resize it a little bit. Okay. And what's nice with the white background is it's very easy to select and delete. That's why I chose it. And the black background also would work, but you don't find many pictures with a black background. So here's the layer, and what I can use, there's the easiest tool here is the magic wand. Okay. It's one of the basic tools of Photoshop. The trick here, first of all, you want to use a couple of the settings. You don't want to sample all layers. You just want that layer with the cow. You want this contiguous button, which means it won't select every white pixel in the image. It will only select white pixels that are connected to the first one that you click on. This last number is called tolerance, and that setting allows you to tweak how precisely it looks for white color. So for example, if I click white now, it gets a pretty good selection. Let me zoom in on that. You can see the kind of marching ants. It gets it very precisely. If I change the tolerance to, say, 100, what you'll see is it might get a softer background. It will allow white pixels, but also pixels that are maybe not so white. It's just how the algorithm works. And if you go the opposite way, 12, say a lower number, it will even more narrowly pick pixels that are close in value. You see how the tail of the cow is getting a little broader in its selection. Anyway, and then you just hit delete. And there goes the background. I'll just do deselect, Command D, or Control D on a PC. And there you go. You have yourself a cow. And of course, I always, again, use the feet. Is that the right size for a cow? Well, no, it's probably a good deal bigger. Once you get the right size in perspective, now you can come down and make copies of the object here and just resize it to be appropriate at wherever the feet happen to be. Okay, and obviously you could make a calf or something like that. The hardest thing is when you have images that have a background. Let's copy this image and go back to our Photoshop document, paste it in, and I'm going to just quickly zoom out so that I can resize this image here. Zoom back in. These images, the only way you can really get them is with what's called the Quick Selection tool. It's right above the magic wand, hiding there usually. And what you do, as you brush over the figure, Photoshop will kind of guess what you want to get. And you see how as I drag over the fingers, the glove here, it kind of gets most of it, but there are some irregularities, some things that are like in this underarm area here or the boots where it's not quite figuring out what you want. Typically, I usually don't have great luck with it. I have to come back in and use another tool. Oops, I need to use Option or Alt on a Mac to get rid of the extra piece. I have to use a variety of tools. You can see here. And you could use the magic a selection tool to try and get rid of the pieces you don't want. Like here, again, I've got the leg area. And sometimes if you're trying to work your way around furniture or like a banister, you'll have to use the linear selection tools. Shift adds them back in, by the way, if you happen to delete something. Anyway, when you do something like this, now I have the guy selected. I could copy and paste. I could also do what's called selecting the inverse, the opposite. So everything that I have selected, it now doesn't look any different, but it is different. It is selected the inverse. Now when I hit delete, the background goes away. Okay, and you can see that I wasn't exactly perfect in this little effort here, so I'd probably want to do a lot more zooming in to find out. Conversely, that may not actually work in this particular scene, so I might not want to use that scale figure. Okay, so that's scale figures. So the next thing that you can do is add in shadows. And let's grab a person here, and we'll make some shadows and maybe some reflections. And the trick with shadows, first of all, I'm going to drag her up here, and I'm actually going to make a group. And a group just allows you to have, so this is the layer with the person on it. I can drag it into the group. It just allows you to control a bunch of layers all at once. Okay, so here it is. Oh, is there another one? Oh, no, that's that one. Okay, so I've got my object. I'm going to duplicate this layer. Okay, so now I have two. And I'll just call this reflection layer for first to make life easy. What you can do, this is a reflection, so I can just drag the copy down so that it looks like it's reflected. Okay, you see that? It's in the ground, but it looks like it is reflected. And these are, again, just using those transform tools. Now, usually the rule of thumb is wherever you're standing, which is kind of here, the station point in the perspective, the shadow should go from the person's feet kind of heading towards you and vanishing. So we need a new tool to help us do that. And that tool, well, there's a number of them, and I'm never sure which one's going to work the best, but they're all called transform tools. And I think distort will probably get us what we want. And what that allows you to do is kind of grab individual pieces of this. Okay, and you see how I can kind of stretch it out, and I'm making it look like it's in perspective. Okay, I can drag the whole thing around. I can also drag these middle lines. Okay, and I'll click plus to check to make that complete. And you can do a number of things. You could change the opacity, of course, so that way it doesn't look like it's, you know, a mirror on the ground. The other thing that you can do is use a filter. And there's a million kinds of filters here, but blur is the one that really gets you what looks to be a... So the filter, the Gaussian blur filter, you can really kind of tweak how blurry it looks. You'll just have to decide. The flooring to me looks like kind of a semi-shiny tile. So you'll probably want some fair amount of realism, but then tweak the opacity so that it looks more realistic. And of course, I have lowered the opacity of the background layer. We'll just crank that back up and see what it looks like. With the full opacity, it's kind of a little soft, but I think I'll just drag this down a little bit so that, because I don't want it that strong for now. Okay, so that's a reflection, and a blur, a shadow works basically the same way. I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I'm just going to use the reflection layer, and I'll call this one shadow. Okay. And so here's the copy, the shadow. Now the trick with the shadow is that the shadow goes in the direction opposite of the window. So I want to rotate this shadow so that it's coming from the window, not coming from the towards the camera. And then I can use those same transform tools, and I'll try distort again and see what we get. And I can drag out the image here, and you can decide how dark or light you want that shadow to be. Okay. And then I move it so that it's on the feet. Now it still doesn't look quite right because it's kind of gray, and well, it still has color really. So what you want to do is make sure your paint color is black, and just come in here and paint it. And this is where that same tolerance number comes in. You want to make sure that it is very tolerant. 200 is pretty high. In fact, maybe towards the top of what you can get. And it will paint it totally black. Okay. Now that looks a little gray because I've faded it out. And of course you can use your same Gaussian blur on the new object to make it look a little softer. Okay, and that usually works pretty well. Finally, you want to make sure that the scale figure is at the top of the group here. That way the feet look like they're on top of the shadow, not the other way around. If the shadows are over the feet, they'll kind of make dark spots on the shoes of the person. Okay. So those are two ways to use kind of the scale figure. The last way is to just draw the shadow in. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new layer. Okay. And I'll put it here. It just jumps right in at the top of the list. And I can just call this, drawn shadow. I don't usually rename the layers, but I'll do it for your sake. Anyway, and here you can come in, and there's so many different ways to draw, but the brush is one of my favorites for this sort of thing because you can choose different shapes for the brush. See here, you can actually drag the shape of the brush. You can change the size of the brush, which is nice. And then you can set the opacity to about 25%. And what that does, that allows you can either draw by just drawing in here. I'll turn off the other layers so you can get a sense. See how I can come in and kind of draw, but it's only drawing 25% at a time. So it's harder to mess it up. You can also just dab by clicking. Hopefully you can hear that click on the computer. And what that does, usually there's a shadow right by the feet. There might be a shadow coming from the back foot here, but then right by the feet, it's typically quite dark. So that kind of adds a little realism to it. And you can play around with this to see what you can come up with in terms of size and in terms of softness. Okay. So, and that's the easiest way, and that's the best for something like furniture, where you just want it kind of black underneath the furniture. All right. A smaller brush will be a little more precise in that situation. Anyway, you can add all these together, and as a group, what's nice is you can turn them off, or if you wanted another person, you can duplicate the group. Call it copy, and now you have a second one. Whoops, forgot to grab everybody in the group. That would help. And you can even lock all these people together. But anyway, now you have a whole second person that you can make use of. And this is nice if you want people, say, way in the background. You can have sort of multiple examples. Obviously, it would need to be fixed depending on the perspectival kind of location. All right, so that is the couple of great techniques for reflections and shadows. All right, doing something like furniture is also a great thing to do in this method. One of the tricks that you get with furniture. So pieces of furniture pose a different kind of problem. Here I have a table selected using the magic selection tool here, the quick selection tool. And I will just copy and paste that into my drawing here. Oh, it's pretty big there. Okay. And to modify the table, sometimes the perspective is off in a way that you can't get by fixing the by using the edit transform tool. There are a number of tools here that might be useful, skewing it in perspective, but sometimes you kind of just want to, I don't know, shorten a leg or shorten a top. For that, what you can do, there are a number of things, but Puppet Warp is really the best one. Edit Puppet Warp. And what this does, this converts the object to a mesh. And what you can do is you can kind of define fulcrum points on the object, and then you can manipulate pieces of the object around these fulcrum points. And this is super handy if, like, in this instance, you just want to kind of shorten the leg, just add in a couple of fulcrum points, and you can shorten that back leg. Or if you wanted to make a scale figure that rotated in some way, that bent, like if you wanted to have the arm come up at an angle, you could go, bend it up at an angle or make it kind of a dancing table if you wanted. I'm not quite sure that's a good idea, but anyway, again, sometimes you can see that the object will behave a little strangely. Things will start to warp like they are here. But in general, this is a pretty quick way to manipulate things like furniture or scale figures that just are a little bit off. Okay, that probably is actually not the best design for this space. Anyway, so those are really some of the most basic editing tools. The only other thing is that sometimes you just can't get it the way you want it. You can't find an image. Then if you have to have something, it's time to look to our modeling software. I have some images here. Let me see. I think I have a table from, this one's from Light Up. Here we go, Light Up table, beautiful. And it comes in, and this one happens to have a lot of background watermarks, but you can set the perspective in your drawing program, Light Up, SketchUp, or Revit, and then try and get it right for your space. And then you have the ability to export a PNG. You can quickly load that into your project and scale it to the size that works in the image. So that's a really nice way. Saves you some, couple of hours fiddling around with the internet. Okay, so now that's kind of the basics of all this Entourage. What you do, make sure you're on the layer that you want to light. So sometimes I'll use this to fix the angle of the light on a scale figure. In this case, I'm just going to use the background. And I'll choose Filter, Render, Lighting Effects. Okay, and if you go here, again, Filter, Render, Lighting Effects. And that's an awfully handy little area. And what you get, first of all, by default, I think just one light source comes in. And it looks kind of like this. It's got a giant oval. Here, I'll zoom out a little bit. And what you can do, whoops, I just made an extra one. Drag that one into the garbage here. And what you can do is grab the light, grab it. The center target allows you to move it. You can use the different grips here to change different things. This one you can see from the highlight, it scales the length. This one rotates it. This one, the inner one that I've grabbed, controls the hotspot angle as opposed to the outer one. And then this length one, I messed that one up, changes the, here we go, now it's an uplight. Okay, there we go, that's kind of cool actually. Anyway, and then this kind of dragger here in the middle controls how bright it is. So the other thing, right now, I am affecting the entire image. So as I drag this hotspot up, let's say I want to have it look like there's a light on the door, the rest of the drawing gets a little dark. So you can change that if you want something really dramatic by dragging the ambience level. If you drag it up, you can see that the rest of the image is pretty much retained. You just get a little bit of lighting effect here. Okay. Click OK. If you just want to light some small portion, then you'll definitely need to select that portion first. I'll show you here. I can light just this kind of wall. Make it look like there's some downlights there. Oop. There we go. I've got just the wall selected. And I go to my Filter, Render, Lighting Effects. And here maybe I'll use, there are some presets up here. Let's see if I can zoom in on that. There's some presets which are very handy. I'm going to use the 3 down option. What that does is it basically, and let me zoom out so you can see them, gives me 3 lights that are all facing down, and I can control each of them individually. Okay, and what you'll see here, you can see in the side that I've got each of the lights listed here. I can turn them on and off and control them individually. Okay. And again, you'd want to maybe think about your design and how that looks, and maybe this angle isn't ideal. But what's going on here, and now I can I can lower the ambience level down a little bit. You'll see a little greater variation. Now when I click OK, it has just applied to the area that I selected. Okay, so it hasn't applied to anything else. It hasn't applied to these figures which are in front. Okay. Okay, the next fun trick that we're going to do to make it look like there's lighting in your space is draw in a sunbeam. And what I've done, I've used my selection tools here to draw what looks kind of like where the sunbeam would go. You know, and you've kind of maybe seen these in old photographs where there's a lot of dust in the interior. It's kind of the effect that I'm looking for. And I created a group here for the sunbeam, and I made a new blank layer. And what I want to do, and again I use the selection tools, I want to fill that layer with just white, okay, just that area. If you choose Edit Fill or Shift F5, you can fill your selection with all sorts of stuff, the background color or patterns, black or white. I'm going to just choose white and OK. And I end up with this basically white filled blob. And I can adjust the opacity of that a little bit. I'm not going to drop it down too much just yet so that you can see the next effect. And what you can do is down here, there's what's called a layer mask. That's the box with a circle in it. And you can apply that to any layer. I'm just going to deselect so I can paint on this whole layer. And on the mask, this box here with the kind of brackets around it, anything that is white, painted white in this mask, will be basically transparent. And anything that's black will be completely opaque. It won't let any of the layers show through. And then gray will be, you know, depending on how gray, it'll be more or less transparent. So what I can do is I can go back to my fill layer, and I could fill it with black or with some selection area. But what I'm going to do instead, what I like here is I'm going to put clouds in there. You might say, why are there clouds coming through the window? Well, look at what it's done. It's made this mask where some of it is black, some of it's gray, and some of it's white. And I can actually change the scale of that and watch what happens. You see how the fog essentially changes kind of its character. Let's see, make it a little small so it looks a little more dusty. Okay, and I'll click check, and that's just changing the mask. I'm not changing the background layer. In fact, some people like to convert this thing to a smart object. If you're doing a lot of these kind of filters on the same white area. For our purposes, I think we'll be fine without the smart object. But anyway, let me just zoom in on this a little bit so you can take a look. And there you go. There's your sunbeam. It still looks a little harsh, but I am getting some nice irregularity there. Maybe I'll crank up the opacity a little bit. Filter. I was blurring the layer mask here. Let's go back to Gaussian blur. There we go. Okay, now we're softening the edge of this thing. And you'll have to use your judgment about how much it gets softened before it starts to not look like sunbeams. Okay. Go about there. Okay. And then I'll adjust. I think it's a little too... There we go. There we go. And you can even have your objects, your scale figures, your furniture available underneath this. Let's see. Let's drag her in there. Right now she's above the sunbeam in our layer list. All I have to do is drag the scale figure down below the sunbeam, and it looks like the sunbeam is crossing in front of her. Okay, so there's so many different things, but this is one that's actually super easy. And let's see. One other lighting effect you can have is essentially kind of a hot spot. It's called a lens flare. And you can apply this to any layer that you want, and it will apply just to that layer, just like the other lighting effects. I'm going to show you a little trick here, which is I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to select all, Command A or Control A, and fill that layer with black. Okay, and just make that normal mode. So there we go. We have a nice black layer, and you might say, that doesn't really look all that great. But what we can do, if we go to Filter, Render, lens flare. Okay, the lens flare, looks just like you would see if you had a camera, and you can kind of control the angle, and there's even kind of how bright it is or not, and there's kind of all these different presets that are loads of fun. I mean, frankly, they're really cool, each one. And I think that might be a little bright for my uses here. Click OK. Applies it to the background layer. Okay. And I'm not sure if I want that in color or black and white, but well, let's leave it black and white right now, or color. Anyway, if you change the blending mode of the layer, and these blending modes are super handy for different things. Multiply is great when you have you want the black to show up on top of the other layer. Screen is basically doing the opposite. So now we only have what's light visible, and you can kind of drag that layer down to get the greatest effect in your image. Okay, so and that's something you can actually now copy the layer, or you can just turn it on and off. Again, anything that's black is basically going to disappear. Anything that has a little lightness is going to shine through. So that's a fun technique. All right, now there are so many ways to kind of finish out our drawing here. One that's probably the easiest is to fix the background layer. So this background layer, what we don't want to do is distract from our design here. We want the design to be the strongest. And there's a couple of things. You could just lower the opacity of the background layer. No, I guess we maybe better turn off some of this other junk here. There we go. We'll leave the giant yellow guy there. You could lower the opacity of the background layer. Okay. And that doesn't always work, because now it's going to, especially if you're printing, that just looks washed out. That doesn't look like there's anything there. Well, there's a couple of options. One option is to kind of, one by one, add in different types of adjustment layers. So if I'm on this layer, I'm on this bottom layer here, and I click on the circle, I could do, say, a brightness contrast adjustment layer. Okay, what it is a separate layer which has kind of different features that you can adjust, and I can kind of wash the inside without really losing the pixels. I'm just kind of changing the pixels, and I can make it more contrasty or less. This image is not particularly strong in that regard, or I can darken it. If I only had a certain area selected, it would only work on those areas. So, for example, here I'll trash that one, and I'll do, this is what's called vignetting. You can select an area. I'm going to feather it, and feather is a technique where you can kind of soften the edge, and the amount that you soften it just depends on how high the resolution is in the image. I think 50 will work here. Then I'm going to select the inverse. So now this perimeter is the only thing that will be affected. And I can come in here with a brightness contrast adjustment layer. Try that one. And let's make it darker. Okay. So you see how darkening that perimeter, it's called vignetting, and it tends to focus your attention in the middle here. Okay. And I can drag it and make it more extreme. All right. Just to see the difference, turn it on and off. Another one that is really nice, I think, for background layers is what's called hue saturation. And here in the hue saturation, you can also control a little bit of the lightness, but you can also control kind of generally how much color is in the image. If I drag this down, you see how it becomes black and white? And what it also does when I do that is suddenly anything that has color really looks very prominent against the background, just by basically removing the color. Okay, and that's a real, you can see how your focus changes just by tweaking the color a little bit. So anyway, those are really great ways to adjust the kind of coloration of the background. One other thing that you can do, and this is again a stylistic concern or consideration, is you can use a number of blurring techniques to blur either the far distance or the foreground. And I'll show you what I mean. If I select, just say, the back wall, and I'll feather that selection a little bit, and then zoom in here so you can see it. if I use one of my blur filters, again, the Gaussian blur is a nice one because it has a lot of controls. I can kind of blur the back wall, and you see how it sort of focuses your attention more forward from that back wall. Okay, and things that are coming out of back into focus, they get more of your attention than kind of what is going on back here. We don't even know. Okay, so that is one thing that you can do. Another thing that I like, it just happens to be a particular favorite of mine, is there's a bunch of these funkier blurs. They're kind of more like cinematic blurs. There's my favorite, tilt shift. What this does, it allows you to blur, say, the foreground or the background, mainly the foreground here, just by dragging these kind of adjusters. Okay, and people use these to make a drawing look like a miniature, for example. Okay, you see, and now the foreground is a little bit blurred. And again, we're just trying to focus people's attention. If this was, trying to have some big dance party right here in the middle, that would tend to draw your attention to that area. And I often think it's really neat to have a object, like a photographic object, not blurred over that blurred background. Sometimes even violating the border of your sheet. Here's somebody foreshortened in the foreground. Looks a little weird, but anyway, that kind of thing can be really effective using your blur along with a number of other features. And of course, if I turn back on the adjustment layers that I created, you can really start to get some wacky stuff going on. Anyway, the last thing that you can do to kind of tweak the overall image, you can save a copy. First of all, save it, right? You want to save it somewhere. But then you want to save a copy, and save like a JPEG is a good image file format. And I'll call this for fiddling with. And because I'm not sure what I want to do, but I kind of want to blend it. Okay, and I should have done the highest resolution there. Where did it go? Fiddling with. There we go. JPEG. What this does, this is called flattening the image. There's no layers now except for this one, and I can double click on it and turn it into a layer that I can edit. Okay, so going back to this one, you can see there's all these layers. It's very complicated. Any filter I apply will only apply to the layer I'm on. And by the way, you can flatten several layers all at once. You can just merge them, or you can just flatten the whole image. But I don't recommend doing that because it is nice to have that original image to go back to. Anyway, now I've got this image. I'll zoom in on it a little bit. And a number of filters here will help kind of to make the image look, blended. So for example, I'll just try this add noise button. And get that out of the way. You can see how by adding noise kind of on top of everything, it just kind of blends. It's kind of almost like a smudge stick. And let's go. You can drop the number way down, and you see it just is a subtle effect. And you can play with these other methods of blending just to see if they happen to work in your image. Okay. I'm not sure if those make any difference at all. And of course, I'm not blending in a particularly aggressive mode. Anyway, what will happen if I undo? It's not a huge effect here, but you can see it's ever so slightly different. Anyway, and then there's other things here that are much more dramatic that will really make things, you see how this makes it look pixelated. You can sometimes use these layers in conjunction with other layers to create kind of a softening effect. Okay, but noise is probably one of the most handy ones, and dust and scratches also works. Again, each of these, it's a look, so you have to be careful to make sure that it like, whoa, is that really what you want? But maybe it is. I don't know. Some of these are more aggressive. Okay, and changing the threshold, we might be able to tweak this around, but you can see it is kind of having a very powerful effect on the background image. Let's see if we can type in a number get that to be a little softer. But now it's not quite merging everything as much as I'd like. Getting a little bit of a fringe here. Anyway, and that is basically a number of effects that you can try to create an interesting image. What I would recommend, what I would like, is you to save this as a PDF file. To, again, save it, and then save as, I believe it's called Photoshop PDF. Okay, save your drawing as a Photoshop PDF, and that is something that you can submit and you can distribute to your clients and whatnot. It will retain all the information you need. And there you go.